Hello team, it's me, JP. Welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is Ukraine War news update for the 2nd of November 2023. Let's get to where we normally start. The Ukrainian General Staff figures for the losses, Russian losses for the day before. All the usual caveats apply. You can find them in the description to this video. Can be seen below. This is an interesting set of stats because we are seeing an uptick where I was expecting a continued downward trend, given that we are seeing the end of the counteroffensive. It is grinding to a trickle, and we are perhaps seeing the end of the Avdiivka attacks from the Russians, although possibly not. And I think these figures indicate that things are still very hot around Avdiivka and perhaps elsewhere as well. 930 personnel is on the high end of the range. 18 tanks, 43 armoured personnel vehicles and 42 artillery systems, 4 multiple launch rocket systems and 3 anti-aircraft warfare systems. These are all above average figures. These are really high figures. 43 armoured personnel vehicles indicates that the Russians are still attacking in, I presume, Avdiivka. 42 artillery systems again goes to the idea that the Ukrainians have done a pretty good job of degrading Russian capabilities in terms of supporting their own maneuvers with artillery and counter-battery fire, something that the Russians themselves routinely complain about. And here is evidence towards that. The question is, to what end is this? Well, we know to what end this is. It's to being able to take territory back, to do their combined arms maneuvers and counteroffensives and whatnot. Now, the follow-on question is, when will that happen? Because this counteroffensive appears to have ground to a halt. There was a reset, so yes, the Ukrainians didn't really take any territory meaningfully, I think, in that counteroffensive. But they kind of reset their objectives and said, we need to do all of what you can see on the screen now. We need to do a lot of this until the Russians are significantly and adequately downgraded so that we can, or degraded, so that we can then take territory back. The question, as I say, is when that will now be. 4 multiple launch rocket systems is over double the daily average. 3 anti-aircraft warfare systems is over 3 times the daily average. 43 armoured personnel vehicles and 42 artillery systems is huge. 18 tanks is massive. This is a bad day for the Russians. 1 aircraft as well added to that. I don't know if that's one from the other day or that's a new one. Well, I'm sure the one from the other day was added, so I think that is a new one. 20 drones, 2 cruise missiles, 34 vehicles and fuel tanks, and 13 pieces of special equipment. Again, 2 categories that are showing really high numbers posted. Logistics are going to be affected, and then possibly electronic warfare or ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, or maybe excavators, whatever. That is 13 vehicles is a high number there. Let's see what Andrew Perpetua has to say in terms of losses. He surveys all of the socials to get a good grip of what is going on a daily basis. He has others that are like backlogs that he knows are from other days. So I think he tries hard to make sure that these lists are relevant for the last 24 hours and not just old stuff. But I can't be sure about that. I'll have a chat to him about that. But does such a good job here. He's now becoming quite relied upon. As far as I can see, a lot of people refer to his figures routinely. Here is a huge list. As you can see, I'm not quite sure why this is split into kind of 2, whether this is accruing 2 days worth or it's just randomly that way. You can see that there's a huge number of losses actually for both sides. It's not quite parity. I think the Russians have lost just a little bit more, but it's fairly close to parity there. Let's have a look at the types of equipment lost here. So for the Russians, the special equipment, we can see electronic warfare. We see a radar system and 2 surveillance and comm systems. So that will be a sore loss for them. I would need to look into the 48YA6K1 and this Karushka 4 electronic warfare system and radar and electronic warfare systems, see whether they are high-value systems or not. But that will surely hurt the Russians a bit. A boat lost there, a number of T-72 tanks, and perhaps a T-90A. That's not the best T-90, but it is a T-90, which is their better tank. Just the variant isn't as good as a T-90M, but that will be a sore loss for them. BMPs, so infantry fighting vehicles, and BTRs, you can see just a huge number of those lost, which then, when you look at the general staff figures and the claims, and you see 43 APVs, and on this list from Andrew Perpetua, you're not seeing 43, but you're seeing an awful lot. You've got APCs here, IFVs. This is, I think, indicative of what we are seeing from the general staff. On the Ukrainian front, and yes, there's some civilian vehicles there which will be used for military purposes. On the Ukrainian front, a couple of M113s, and then we have a Striker vehicle, so that's a bit of a loss. We've got some fairly significant losses going down the list. The 3 Bradleys there, a number of tanks. In fact, that's probably the heaviest tank losses I've seen for a long time. I don't know whether this is, as I say, an accumulation or whether this definitely happened yesterday. Leopard 2A4 is not great. That's abandoned, and you'd imagine the Russians will try pretty hard to take that out with the drone. And the way that these are lost as well is actually quite a variation today, quite a variety. A lot of unknown causes, but then some mines together with ATGMs, FPV drones, Lancets, and so on. So yeah, a good mix. There are some AS-90s. Those are UK provided from the 1990s howitzers, self-propelled howitzers, M777, so on and so forth. So yeah, quite a bad day at the office, I guess, for the Ukrainians as well as for the Russians. And I don't know what that indicates. This would, without looking at any other data, if I just looked at this, I'd think the Ukrainians were on the attack somewhere themselves. To lose these sort of tanks and Bradleys and whatnot. This could be the activity going on up in Avdiivka, where they're doing a counterattack, and they supposedly took a couple of kilometers north of Krasnohorivka, as I reported yesterday, and this could be the result of that. And it just goes to show that you go on the attack, you're going to lose stuff. It's just the way it goes. Right, moving on. I did want to actually look at what that Oncilla is there, because that's not something I've seen before. Well, I never. A year and a half into this, and I've not seen an Oncilla or heard of it. But it's designed in Ukraine, built in Poland. It is an armored car, some kind of armored car. Let's have a look. Recently, the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense announced so this is March 2023, its Director of Intelligence received a modernized Oncilla armored car paid for by donations from Transelect, a Polish company founded by a citizen in Ukraine to acquire equipment. The vehicle was originally a Ukrainian design known as a Dozor B that began development in 2004. By the time the state-owned defense company Ukroboronprom suffered major production issues, and by 2016 only 10 had been delivered. Those that were delivered proved unsatisfactory, so production was outsourced to a Cypriot company, Lassonaire. In 2019, they modified the design, including the addition of a new Italian engine, and contracted the Polish heavy construction equipment manufacturer Mista to produce it. The Oncilla is a result of this, and 30 were delivered before the war began in 2022. There are 30 such machines that are already fighting. They showed themselves very well on the battlefield, saving lives, said Viktor Levchenko, the representative of the Beryl Design Bureau. So there you go. I could give you more information, but that's enough to get on with. It is that. So one of those was lost. Anyway, moving on from Perpetua's list, just to get an idea of other things that are going on that affect those lists. Ukrainian info warfare drives Russian military desertions. US general says Ukrainian information warfare has driven 17,000 Russian soldiers off the battlefield. US Army Special Operations Commander Jonathan Braga said, as reported by Business Insider on November the 1st. Messaging has played a huge role in a tactical and operational sense, Braga said at the Association of the US Army's annual conference held on October 9th to 11th. So interesting. I don't know if that means desertions leading to becoming POWs. 17,000 is a high number, and they are off the battlefield. It could be desertions. Also, we have heard indeed that Georgia are taking desertions as well, and there are people doing that kind of psychological work in Georgia, actual Georgians, as well as there being Ukrainians doing that within Ukraine. Previously undocumented Russian losses during attacks on Avdiivka shown in a thread by OSINT UA. So Special Curse on Cat here just lists just a huge number of vehicles and gives geolocations and evidence for those. These are ones that were previously undocumented. So the idea that, you know, people have done this work to say, well, at least 109 were destroyed, and possibly as many as 200. Or people are keeping on adding to that list as more footage comes out. In fact, Geo confirmed says in their investigation of the Russian Avdiivka offensive, based on open sources and double checked by Comsat image, since the offensive started on the 9th or 10th of October, Russian losses are now 197 vehicle losses, 18 potential vehicle losses, and a losses damaged or destroyed. So that is to say almost certainly over 200 were lost in that time, and that's your benchmark minimum. So the reality will be more than that, because it's unlikely that every single one will be documented. But as I keep saying, well, anyway, let's just continue this thread, because I just want to say something about this. Losses older than 9th are in purple. At least 61 are filtered out. Every loss after the 9th of October is double checked. So there are more losses from around there. So the 61 filtered out. So that's like another 61. That's almost in that area. We're moving on to almost 300. Methodology: losses of a vehicle is more than 3 days on the exact same place most of the time, but burn marks destruction is visible. Less than 10 were moved before the 31st of October. Potential loss: no second footage available to confirm it as a loss. So if they've only got one bit of footage, then they say that's maybe a loss, and there's only 18 of those. And anyway, just a really good analysis of that. This is great open source intelligence work, all sort of marked, pinned on maps. This is an awful lot of equipment that was lost in those 20 days. But this, what I was going to say, you know, when you're losing 43 APVs across the front line in a day, you think that's a massive number, and then you go and look at just one small area of the front line, and you think there's over 200 there, and almost 300 if you count stuff that was existing there already. Then, you know, these claims aren't too fanciful. But I was going to talk about drones, because I was talking yesterday about how I really feel that drones have changed the war, and that you can't move anywhere without being seen. It's a really big point. And actually, it's fascinating to see Zaluzhny talk about that in his article, in The Economist. We're going to go on and speak about that in a minute, and I'm probably going to do a separate video just on Zaluzhny's writing and interview, because there's so much important stuff that's come out of that. But what's really nice from my own kind of imposter syndrome situation is that, you know, I make claims and I'm like, do I know what I'm talking about? And Zaluzhny himself has like hit on so many of the things that I've been discussing with you guys over the last few weeks in terms of the counteroffensive, that it is somewhat validating, and I appreciate that, Zaluzhny. Thanks for that. Anyway, in Avdiivka, and this is from Zaluzhny as well, on the screens of our monitors when I was there, we saw 140 vehicles on fire, destroyed within 4 hours. So his claim, and he's your top guy, and you can call that BS or whatever, but I don't think he's the kind of guy he seems pretty straight up. It's like 140 vehicles in a 4-hour period on fire. And I was looking at the command and control screens, and that was what was happening. Ukrainian soldiers, just moving on, have discovered and damaged the expensive Russian radio relay station, the 48, I assume that's a YA6, because that's what we saw earlier, K1 Podlet. I wonder whether this is high value. Well, it turns out it is high value. According to the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, such equipment is used by the enemy to detect air targets at low and extremely low altitudes, The object was damaged in the border zone near the Belgorod region. As a result of the operation, the Russian radio relay station was put out of order and the enemy's personnel suffered losses, the message says. So that's good news for the Ukrainians there. And this is the Teplinsky attack. So I shared this with you yesterday in my frontline update, actually, because it had just happened. I thought it was relevant to share with you. This morning at 11 a.m., so it's yesterday, Ukraine attacked the HQ of the newly appointed Teplinsky. So he's in charge of the forces where it was Makarovich in the Kherson area. He reportedly survived, though Russian telegram channels reported only one dead. Initially, subsequent message suggests that Teplinsky's staff has suffered. So the Russian message is today, the command post of the Dnipro group, which was headed by Colonel General Teplinsky, this week was struck. At the moment, it's known that at least one soldier was killed and several were seriously injured. It's unknown whether Teplinsky was at the command post at the time. The area of the strike has been called and the command has been given to prevent the dissemination of information about the fact of the hit. The press centre is preparing a statement about the successful destruction of another ATACMS missile. I don't think they can really take down those ATACMS. And the reason why is because the Ukrainians have been given the oldest ATACMS. And on the one hand, you might think, oh, what a shame they'd be given the oldest variants of the ATACMS. But the oldest variants use INS, inertial guidance, to do their job, which, although they might not be as accurate, it doesn't matter so much because they're using cluster munitions, so they might not be pinpoint accurate. But what that also means is the Russians will be unable to GPS jam it because it doesn't use GPS. So actually, having those oldest ATACMS is perhaps a bit of a boon. Anyway, I talked about this strike yesterday. He probably isn't dead, but it is a useful strike. Now, Shoigu reported that Russian air defense units shot down 37 Ukrainian planes just a week after shooting the previous 24. He's already made calculations of destroying F-16s that aren't in Ukraine yet, and I talked about this yesterday. Russian Defense Ministry has reported destroying all Ukrainian aircraft in the first week of the war, by the way. So they have routinely talked nonsense here. I just wanted to read what he actually said in this kind of debriefing conference thing. So the air defense units are operating successfully. Over the last month, they have destroyed more than 1,400 means of enemy air attack, including 37 aircraft and 6 United States-made ATACMS operational tactical missiles. Again, I think that's highly unlikely due to the fact that they're just so difficult to shoot down. At the same time, I would like to note that 37 airplanes is almost twice the number of F-16s guaranteed to be delivered to Ukraine. That is, with the way our air defense systems work, it would take about 20 days. So that's what he said. Now, I will add that there are claims that, and I think this might come from Zaluzhny himself, there are claims that, for example, around the southern Zaporizhia region, that they have experimental S-400 air defense systems, the Russians, that can reach beyond the city of Dnipropetrovsk. That's really significant if that is the case. So I do think the Russians do have significant air defense systems that need to be taken out for the Ukrainians to consider getting any further in this war in terms of territory gained. They need to, and the Ukrainians know this, and that's why you see, I talked about this in my analysis yesterday, this is why you've seen air defense systems be one of the number one targets since the beginning of the counteroffensive. And before, you look at Dell's statistics that are linked below. They are open source, so you can go and check them out. They are the general staff figures, though, just compiled over time, and you will see that the air defences have been severely degraded since sort of April, May time. But there are still systems that need to be, the high-value systems that sit further behind the front lines need to be taken out. Another rail arson in Russia, in Siberia, on a rail track near 2 airports in Tyumen. Railway cabinets again sabotaged and satellite near the Utyashevo station, according to SHOT. The station is used to transport cargo to and from local Plekhanovo International Roschino airports, and Plekhanovo and the International Roschino airports. So always good when the Russians help out the Ukrainians themselves. Here we're moving on to distant strikes, and there's not too much to report. There's a few interesting nuggets, though. Russia has already spent $22.8 billion on missile attacks on Ukraine and continues to increase their production, according to Forbes. As of October 2023, the occupiers have launched more than 3,000 missiles across Ukraine, and $0.5 to $1 billion is spent on missile attacks every month. That is pretty huge. But as you can see here, some really not very many sent in October, and that indicates, I think, the stockpiling, and you're going to see some massive waves, probably maybe the biggest strikes, biggest numbers of both missiles and drones sent into Ukraine since the beginning of the war, is my prediction. Certainly it's what I would do. You got to completely overwhelm air defenses in order to make sure you get the highest number of hits. This is Yuri Ihnat. Territory of Ukraine is a huge state at the center of Europe. We do not have the means to close it completely from Russian attacks, the Air Force spokesperson Yuri Ihnat has said. Quote, air defense systems have a certain radius of action from 2 kilometers for small fire groups to 70 kilometers for the S-300. Therefore, we do not have enough means to make echelon air defense a complete wall, he noted. And this is where the Russians might have some advantage with some of their S-400 systems, but then the Ukrainians are getting in things like Patriot and Nazams, but they are going to be placing them around their key cities, and that means that along the front line there, I would assume there is a lack of quality ranged air defense systems that the Ukrainians can use. To add to the strike, well, there haven't been many or any cruise missile strikes last night, as far as I can work out, or drone attacks, so it could be a zero there, but they are still shelling. Kherson is still getting hammered on a daily basis. Elderly woman's killed, and officials say no fewer than 40 shells were fired at the village of Stanislav, around 40 kilometers west and down the coast from Kherson. So one village is just getting hammered by artillery there, but that's happening up and down the Dnipro. Local Telegram channel, so this is going back to what I was talking about earlier, the strike against Teplinsky, but there's possibly 2 separate areas that were hit yesterday. Telegram channel Crimea Wind reports an attack on occupied Crimea was successful yesterday morning. Here's a translation of the post. The Arabat Spit is a thin strip of land which is one of the connections to Kherson region, with some small resorts on the beaches. The attack today was successful. Russian military locations in at least 2 captured resort establishments on the Arabat Spit were hit, probably by missile strikes. Local residents report the attack is continuing and drones have been spotted over the Arabat Spit. The missiles hit 2 recreation centres, the Uni boarding house and the Blue Flame boarding house in the village of Strelkovye. These children's health resorts were carried away by the Russians, and their locations are there, residents of the Henichesk community said. According to local testimony, ambulances and fire trucks left Henichesk and the village of Genishcheskaya Gorka for Strelkovye, so on and so forth. That is to suggest that Storm Shadow missiles were used to strike what are almost certainly, they once were boarding houses used for holidaymakers or whatnot in the Arabat Spit area, but are now requisitioned by the Russian army and are routinely hit. 2 of them were hit yesterday, and here are more details on that. 2 Russian bases hit in Henichesk. This is the northeastern sector of Crimea, where you have the Arabat Spit coming down from Henichesk. That's where there's bridges that have been hit. Chonhar, Henichesk routinely have been attacked previously. But I think that's separate from the Teplinsky attempt, which might well be... I don't know exactly where that took place. It's just general claims about it. And yeah, a strike was carried out at a command post in Dnipro group, headed by Teplinsky. So yeah, several things going on there. And I think we'll, as I've said the other day, are likely to see more and more ATACMS being used, because I think they have ATACMS in Ukraine, with probably a bunch sitting in Germany ready to go too. So yeah, expect to hear more ATACMS news. Now, we're going to go on to other bits and pieces here, and this article in The Economist is one thing from Zaluzhny, and actually The Economist has done really well here because they've got an article, but they've also got an essay that Zaluzhny himself has written, Modern Positional Warfare and How to Win, in it. So what can we learn from the article? So much in this article. Let's go to Shashank Joshi, who is the defense correspondent for The Economist. I don't know if it's him that penned this. Sometimes I can't find who writes Economist articles. They just have them, and they don't say who writes them. But nevertheless, we'll pop into what Shashank Joshi says. This week, The Economist spoke to Valery Zaluzhny, Ukraine's commander-in-chief, and this has done the rounds, this article. Everyone's talking about it. On the state of the war, it's a fascinating and important interview. Quote, just like in the First World War, we have reached the level of technology that puts us into a stalemate. This is super important. It goes back to what I was talking about yesterday. We also published an opinion piece by Zaluzhny on what he thinks is needed to break out of a positional war. He says air superiority is key to ground operations and emphasizes technology, drones, electronic warfare, new sorts of mine breaching and counter-battery technology. Finally, you can read a full-length essay by him in which he elaborates on these ideas over 4,000 words plus. The need, quote, the need to avoid a positional war, such as the trench war of 1914 to 18, necessitates a search for new and non-trivial approaches. First, on the interview, Zaluzhny expresses four hypotheses I circulated yesterday. He says that the war is in a stalemate. He says, quote, there will most likely be no deep and beautiful breakthrough, and he largely blames the state of military technology. It's interesting that Zaluzhny's view of the battlefield is a familiar one. The modern sensors and precision weapons can make it prohibitively hard and costly for ground forces to concentrate, move, and attack. This is what I was talking about, drones, and this is that validation I was talking about. You can't move anywhere, whether you're Russian or Ukrainian, around the battlefields without being spotted in the air by drones. This was not the case in any previous war. Yes, there has been satellite technology and half-decent ISR capabilities you talk about in the 90s in Iraq, but this is a new level. Everything is filmed, and sometimes filmed from three angles. You've got FPV drones, you've got a spotter drone, and sometimes a more distance higher up drone, maybe a Bayraktar or something. It's got all of these eyes in the sky that mean that nothing can be done without being spotted. And as soon as you're spotted, you are a target. That is an acquired target. You can then be hit by artillery that now has a range of up to 50 kilometers, and you've got precision guided munitions that you can fire, Excalibur rounds. Then you've got, GIMLRs, guided multiple launch rocket systems that can fire HIMARS at you. You've got, you can be 100 kilometers behind the front line, spotted by a drone, and you're hit by HIMARS. This is just, it's not to mention cruise missiles and ATACMS and GLSDB and JDAMs and all this kind of stuff that can be brought to bear against any kind of target that is spotted on the battlefield, or behind the battlefield. Zaluzhny suggests the key issue is not just more arms. Quote, this war cannot be won with the weapons of the past generation and outdated methods. It is technology, and I've come to see this for sure. He is enthusiastic about his meetings with Eric Schmidt, the ex-CEO of Google, on artificial intelligence, drones and electronic warfare. His essay shows the influence of the likes of Eric Schmidt. Air superiority, Zaluzhny argues, requires simultaneous en masse use of cheap unmanned aerial decoys and attack drones to overload the enemy's air defense system. Yes, Zaluzhny's emphasis on electronic warfare cannot be overstated. It is key to the drone war, he suggests. He speaks highly of Russian performance and says Ukraine needs more Western ELINT and more electronic warfare from drones during assault operations. For more context on electronic warfare in the Ukraine war, see the relevant chapter in my special report from July, says Joshi. In my view, Zaluzhny's view of technology is too simple. What tends to be more important than technology is how it's adopted in tactics, concepts and doctrine, and the impact is often incremental, not revolutionary. Zaluzhny's view on air power is pessimistic, says Joshi. He says air superiority is vital to ground ops, but Ukraine is not going to achieve that. He plays down the role of F-16s, doesn't get a mention in his essay, and says Russian air defense is adapting and improving fast. That's significant, and that's where he talks about that distance of the S-400, the experimental S-400. Zaluzhny, to his credit, is brutally honest about the offensive and his efforts to come to terms with its shortcomings. This is more than can be said for certain pro-Ukrainian types who call people vatniks and pro-Russians for expressing what the general has said. May well be the case. Hopefully I don't do that, but at the same time, well, hopefully I am realistic in what Ukraine are doing and what they're achieving or not. Finally, kudos to doesn't matter for the rest there. So that's a précis of his article, but I am actually going to go through the article. It's not a massive article, but I'm going to go through that and give my commentary to it in a separate video. I'm going to go to what Zaluzhny has written here and given to the Economist, but I'm just going to go to the conclusion here. So I think it says all that needs to be said. Key takeaways. The transition of the war to a positional form leads to its prolongation and carries significant risk for both the Ukrainian armed forces and the state as a whole. In addition, it is beneficial to the enemy, who is trying in every possible way to reconstitute and increase its military power. To get out of this positional form at the current stage of warfare, first of all, it is necessary to 1. Gain air superiority. 2. Breach mine barriers in depth. 3. Increase the effectiveness of counter-battery and electronic warfare. 4. Create and prepare the necessary reserves. It should be taken into account that the widespread use of information technology in military affairs and the rational organisation of logistics support play a significant role in finding a way out of the positional form of warfare. The need to avoid transitioning from a positional form to a maneuverable one necessitates searching for new and non-trivial approaches to break military parity with the enemy. And I think this is going to be in terms of, I was talking about this yesterday, in terms of drones, where Ukraine often have a couple of month lead on drone capabilities. So first person view drones, they were used en masse by the Ukrainians before the Russians. We are starting to see Ukrainians be able to use FPV drones to 22 kilometers is the longest we've seen. Now, if they've got that advantage over the Russians, then they need to use that and absolutely pile the front line with those. But I also think it's just distance munitions, things like HIMARS and ATACMS and Storm Shadows, cruise missiles, just overload the Russian air defenses and just smack every single target they can get. Just they have to, because actually that's where they've got, that's where they're doing a really good job. Because I think it's taking advantage of your advantages, right? They have ISR advantages in terms of satellite and intelligence using all the NATO forces. That's a huge advantage they have. And if they can acquire targets in better time than the Russians can in sort of real time, then they need to use that, which they are, but they just need more of that. So although he says we don't need more of anything, it's not like more weapons, we need different types of weapons. Well, actually, I would argue you do need more of those weapons, because I would just use them like crazy and then start using HIMARS and because you don't have air superiority. If you can't get air superiority, then you need to blow up trenches and places like Verbove, flatten them with JDAMs, GLSTB, HIMARS, and artillery ammunition, artillery shells. So you still need more of all that stuff, and you could use that kind of like in the whole Russian doctrine, God of War, flatten a place and then move in. I think the Ukrainians are going to have to do that because they are struggling to use it in a combined arms way where artillery is supporting you. Actually, you're getting stuck and bogged down in trying to move forward. So you need to do what the Russians do, which is flatten a place and then move in. That's my opinion. But they also, Zaluzhny here is also talking about we need to be able to come up with some kind of new tech that completely breaks their drone usage or whatever it is, so that we have that big advantage, and then we can move on from there. Tendar says again, the five things that I've just talked about there. He gives a little bit of analysis. He outlines most of these aims can be achieved and what has to be done both internally and also with the context of the international community to achieve that goal. The most important point, in my opinion, is his recommendations of extending Ukraine's indigenous military industry. I agree with this. What is less known is that Ukraine has considerably changed the way that they produce weapon-grade products since February 2022. Before, Ukraine's industrial military complex resembled more of what we saw in the Soviet Union. It was made up primarily of state-owned, very inefficient and corrupt entities. This has changed considerably since the open war. A huge amount of startups have been created and they deliver a very efficient stream of innovative products, especially when it comes to the drone industry. Since those products are tested on a daily basis in real-life situations, they achieve proficiency which rival large military companies all over the world. Ukraine has a good chance to follow Israel in that matter, which was also forced to build a homegrown weapons industry and which is considered today one of the best in the world. Zaluzhny's statements are a sobering reminder that despite Russia's shortcomings, it is imperative not to underestimate the enemy. Russia still enjoys some significant advantages, which thanks to the Ukrainian ingenuity but also heroism as well as the support from the West has been compensated. But more has to be done in order to conclude this war and throw Russia back to the 1991 borders without enduring a war which goes on for many years. This also requires the West to finally use its high potential and increase production facilities. We will need them not only for Ukraine but also for ourselves. Interesting, and I broadly agree there. All right, moving on. Russian online search trends show increased interest in supporting the military. Search requests in Russia for, quote, assisting the war on Russia's search engine Yandex have were 7 times higher in October 2023 than last year. Ukrinform reported on November the 1st, citing the Brand Ukraine organization. So this is people within Russia wanting to help their own military more has become a bigger thing, right? More people are searching how to help their military. And you could do a little bit of discussion on that, really, of would they be doing that if their military wasn't in such a difficult situation in terms of not having enough equipment, low morale, poor training, etc., food provisions. So I think it probably tells you something that. Anton Gerashchenko here, though, on a somewhat similar note, says, curious statistics. According to recent Russian polls, more than 70% of Russians would support Putin's decision if he decided to end the war against Ukraine already this week. The poll was conducted by the Russian Levada Center, which is completely under the control of the Kremlin. This means that they have released this information into the public space intentionally. However, the poll also shows that if Putin decided to end the war on the condition of returning the seized territories, only a third of Russians would support his actions. That's interesting, though. On a poll like this, where it's going to skew pro-Kremlin, people are going to not be wanting to answer as honestly as they would like for fear of reprisals, and also the idea that they're just going to make up stats. These statistics are really revealing. To say that a third of Russians are up for, allowing the Russian army to move out of Ukraine and give up those occupied territories is quite incredible, I think. So, yeah. And for that many, 70% of Russians supporting Putin's decision to end the war this week, is huge. Absolutely huge. And I think this is testing the ground. What do people... It's not... It's funny. Testing the ground as to what people think, because this is what people think. But if you put this information out there, you are then testing to see how well received it is. So whether, again, that might question as to whether it's actually made up and sort of putting this out there. We've made this up because if these were really robust statistics, you wouldn't need to sound out because this is what people think. So there's an element of perhaps they have tampered with these to some degree, but they're putting the idea out there. This is something the Russians are very good at, which is throwing loads of ideas out there and seeing which ones stick. This could be something that's happening there. Now, on the other hand, Russian MP Boris Vishnevsky from Yabloko faction has had his microphone cut off in a legislative assembly in St. Petersburg when he spoke from the tribune about peace talks with Ukraine. The deputy said that Yabloko is in favor of an early ceasefire and the starts of negotiations, and that the draft budget presented suggests continued financing of the war. After that, the deputy's microphone was cut off. Wisniewski was told that Parliament is not the tribune for political statements and not a place for discussions. Interesting. That's significant, though, because one, it's again showing that there are people that are prepared to say, actually, no, not up for this war. But also shows you that there's not a place for that too, because the Russians don't agree with freedom of speech. So all those liberty-loving Russian pro-Kremlin voices on my threads and elsewhere claiming that Ukraine doesn't have freedom of speech and whatnot, look what happens there. Right, I talked about this yesterday, but just to give you an idea of who he is, that's who he is, Prigozhin. Prigozhin's son, so Pavel Prigozhin, 25-year-old Pavel Prigozhin, the only heir to his father's empire, has become the head of Wagner PMC, which has now become a subdivision of the Rosgvardia. So those are the internal riot police type people in Russia. Perm Portal 59.ru reported, citing a representative of the regional branch of the private military company. PMC Wagner has become part of the Rosgvardia and resumed the recruitment of volunteers in Perm. Recruitment has been underway for several days, Russian media has reported. It is noted that the group will not accept former mercenaries who moved to the Russian Defense Ministry after the Prigozhin mutiny. This is all kind of weird, because surely this guy knows that the Russians killed his father. Surely he's not that stupid. Why would you go and work for the Russian the very people that are responsible for killing your father? And your father was absolutely against the Russian MOD. He was like slagging them off routinely. It's just such a bizarre situation. Right, this idea about Putin dying and then there being body doubles and all sorts of stuff, which I find fascinating, because it's all titillating, because actually there's really good evidence to suggest that that is the case. Well, now Ukraine's intelligence has come out and said the Putin's death was fake news with the intention of testing Russian reactions, which is exactly what I was just talking about, how they put things out there to see how it falls. Fake news of Putin's death was spread by Russia itself to gauge reactions and analyze individuals, elites, and media, a Ukrainian intelligence official has said, according to Euromaidan Press. I don't know. I mean, I don't know what to think now with regard to whether he has died. And it's the thing about him dying is it's so plausible because he has health issues, but then it's a case of which Putin are you talking about. I saw a photo this morning when I was checking my sources, I think, or maybe last night. It was a photo from a news article of Putin winking, right? And it was an old photo, and it's like, that is 100% a different Putin than this sort of more rounded face, and the chin was different. Someone was saying yesterday that you can't, like, plastic surgery things like chins very easily, and so there are giveaway characteristics to people's faces that might help distinguish between Putins, if you like. But I looked at that photo and I was like, 100% that is a different Putin. Like, there's no doubt in my mind. It's just a totally different person. Anyway, military, Russian planes dropping. Do you know who reminds me of? And that photo, as a guy, actor, what was he? Was he not in, not The Saint, not the old Mission Impossible? Like, I'm sure he was in a Bond film. I'm going to have to find that actor. I know who it is. Man, I've just had like a 15-minute sidebar on IMDb. I can't find it. There's an actor from the 70s, 80s that looks a little bit like Putin, and I've just realised that's who Putin reminds me of so often. Anyway, oh my goodness, what a waste of time that was. Right, to continue. I'm sure someone will help me. Please help me. Right. Russian planes have been dropping explosives on a Black Sea shipping corridor. Russian warplanes have dropped explosive objects along the likely route of civilian vessels in the Black Sea 3 times in the past 24 hours, according to Ukraine's Southern Operational Command yesterday. That is significant, and obviously is, well, not obviously, but one would argue that is war criminal. And finally, Just a little note on Avdiivka. ISW has announced that Avdiivka is a microcosm of Russian command's wider failure. Just a little dip into this. Avdiivka is a microcosm of the Russian General Staff's wider failure to internalize and disseminate lessons learned by Russian forces during previous failed offensive efforts in Ukraine. Analysts said the ISW cited similarly catastrophic Russian infantry assaults involving armored vehicles, particularly a winter offensive in western Donetsk Oblast last year. So that was the Vuhledar, the disaster that was there. According to ISW, Russian forces have launched such attacks in multiple sectors of the Ukrainian front since the start of the all-out war. The current offensive near Avdiivka has also led to intense casualties among Russian troops, signaling a deeper strategic failure. Quote, the fact that the two very distinct groupings of forces have engaged in similarly ineffective operations suggests that the Russian military command is struggling to learn and disseminate lessons across the theatre, and that that Gerasimov is ultimately responsible for this failure. There you go. Anyway, thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. Sorry this has been a particularly long one. There's lots to talk about with regard to Zaluzhny and whatnot. Take care. Speak soon.